Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for your words. Thank you for John gave me happy to know.
I've been sort of working with that.
It takes, you don't do it in a day, do you? You do not come up with something like that on Wednesday.
And we'll continue conversation about that. So.
I have been reading, I've learned in my life, I read a chapter for a couple of weeks, and I'm currently in just forget if I'm in 16 or 17, but it's the same story as the gospel story. I can't remember, is it on a map?
I think it's John 14.
So is John 14, right? And I'm in John 16 and 17.
Yeah.
It always does.
Yes, we're ready to go.
For someone who's like,
Sure, yeah, send it to me.
Well, I'm not going to welcome you again. I've already done that once today. And nor am I going to reintroduce our guests, because I'm sure they're going to say a little bit more of who they are and why they're here. But I invite you, as you're able, if you need to go, I know a couple of people have said to me, I'm afraid we've got plans. So if you need to go, we won't stare and laugh and point, I promise. But I'm just going to hand over to John now for our in-discussion time.
Friends, it's lovely to be here with you in person. Jason has picked up on what a warm congregation we are, and I know he's happy to be here with us as well. The format for what we will do together is identical to what we did last year after the John Albert Hall lectures with Christiana. So we'll talk about 30 minutes and then have about 30 minutes for you to have questions. And if you don't have questions that last for 30 minutes, no harm will come to us. So,
Alistair's going to bring the mic
yes, and
around.
Alistair will be Mike Donahue for those who remember that very dated reference now.
Phil Donahue.
Phil, is it Phil Donahue? Oh, fine, Phil Donahue. Yeah. So let me begin with an introduction of our speaker. The Reverend Dr. Jason McKinney is a theological educator and an Anglican priest based in the West End, Toronto neighborhood of Parkdale. He serves a multiracial congregation in the neighborhood, where he has also been part of a movement to ensure community well-being against the pressures of gentrification. He was a member of the first community-elected board of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, one of the first urban community land trusts in Ontario, where he served 2 terms. He has a PhD from the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. Delighted to know that he's a fellow nerd. He has taught courses on hospitality, urbanism, and theology of food at Trinity College's Faculty of Divinity, and is currently on a research contract with Tyndale Seminary. Now, all those basic facts are, of course, quite impressive in their own right. But over the last several days, as I've had the pleasure to talk and listen to Jason, I think it's vital for me to add that he is a prophet and a genuine radical in the best sense of the term. Now, Jason may come across as a mild-mannered priest and intellectual, but do not let appearances fool you. His commitment to affordable housing and to resisting the ways in which financial capital is eviscerating the possibility of affordable housing for more and more human beings is profound and far-reaching. You might have to know something about his past as a rock singer and lead vocalist to know that Reverend Dr. Jason McKinney means to be about trouble. And good trouble, as the late John Lewis would say. So let's welcome a wonderful troublemaker to our midst. As you know from the sermon, Jason is deeply concerned about land issues and affordable housing, and these are intimately related in your thinking and your writing. What we don't know, not even me, is how you came to be interested in these issues in the first place. So if you could fill us in on this part of your autobiography.
Sure. First of all, we're in BC. Do you know Nardwar the Human Serviette? That was, so he interviews rock bands.
Oh.
And he always digs into the archives and finds things that surprise them,
Yeah.
that he knows. So when you dropped the band thing, I felt like I was being interviewed by Nardwar.
I have an informant.
I figured. So the issue of land is relatively a recent interest of mine, but it emerged, as most things that draw me to do deeper reflection come out of kind of concrete experiences of a sense of urgency or crisis that emerge. And it was, so I know a couple of people know the Parkdale neighborhood. It's not unlike many urban neighborhoods in big cities. It's rapidly changing, and it's changing in a particular direction. So it's historically been a place welcoming and affordable for newcomers, and it's also historically a place where psychiatric survivors could come to find services and affordable places to live. But it's increasingly becoming a place only for the wealthy. And that is the result of middle-class desire to move back downtown after having fled to the suburbs for a time. It also has to do with the way that real estate investment trusts are buying up, especially towers and apartment housing, in order to turn those into investment opportunities for their shareholders. And if you're primarily interested in making money off of a building like that, you're going to have less care and attention for the people who live there, especially the folks who were there because it was affordable. And so that's another piece of the rapid change. So I became really interested in the question of gentrification and what it is that a Christian person, that the church, that a theological lens could bring to the question of gentrification and to the resistance to the displacement that always comes along with it. And nothing was coming from the church, but there was in the neighborhood, a movement was emerging, a community economic development movement, and a big part of that was the desire to start an organization which was a community land trust. And the purpose of the community land trust would be to buy land in the neighborhood, to hold it for community use into perpetuity, so that it didn't stay in the speculative market, it didn't get bought up by investors or developers. And then this dream became a reality, how many years ago now? Maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And I was around as it was coming to fruition, and then as you mentioned in the bio, I served on the board for a few years. But there was something about that initiative that captured me even before I knew what they were going to do. As soon as my friend told me this thing that they were talking about, there was an immediate, I'd say it's something like this, the Spirit drew me to that for some reason, and I stuck with it. And then what I discovered, while I was on the board, the land trust acquired their first piece of land, which happens to be immediately behind the church where I have been for about a decade now. The church never owned that land. It was privately owned. It was in a laneway, and the city would not run power back there. So somebody wanted to buy the land. They bought it because they wanted to build a house. They weren't able to do it. And so it's a beautiful story. I won't go into the detail, but the way that this a woman who I served on the board with was an ESL teacher at the library, which was right there. She started having conversations with the landowners and said, "Why don't you sell us the land for really cheap?" And so they did. And so because there was no possibility of housing, which is the real need, it became an urban agriculture site and a site for community gatherings of various kinds. And every time I attended a gathering on that space, rarely was it explicitly spiritual, but sometimes it was. There's a very large Tibetan community in the neighborhood. So we've celebrated Dalai Lama's birthday on that site a number of times, but there was something spiritual about what was happening on that land. And that just drew me further into the thinking about what does it mean to reflect theologically on this movement of the Spirit that's happening literally outside of the church, really right behind the church. But I think that's really what drew me in, was that experience on the Milky Way Garden.
Tell us about the Milky Way Garden. I mean, I myself am uniquely skilled at killing plants quickly. I'm wondering, perhaps you're better at keeping things alive. Do you have your hands in the soil, or
No.
what is the church's involvement with this new garden, and how is the life of the community, the church community, being shaped by this immediate presence in its backyard?
Yeah, that one's hard to gauge. There are a few members of the congregation who are involved in the community and so are part of it that way. It's yet to be seen. I think there's real opportunities for the church to be partnering locally and preserving land for community use. We haven't quite figured out exactly how that will work. But there is, the Milky Way Garden is what we call that little piece of laneway land. And it was, so I'll say a little bit more about the story. So this friend of mine who I mentioned had a conversation with the landowners, not just to hand it over, but to say, I have an ESL class that I teach of newcomers, mostly Tibetan seniors. And when they were in India or Nepal or Tibet prior to that, they worked with the land. They were farmers. But now they live in apartment towers. So they're distanced from the land that they were accustomed to working with, and she said it would really be great if we could have a place for them to garden. So at first it was just a use. They were able, so somebody was holding them, they had the land, they gave it to the Tibetan gardeners to hold and to use. And then as this possibility emerged for the land to actually be transferred to the land trust, this was sort of the principle behind it. What was the historic use of that site? That leads to an ownership kind of right in some way. So there was a commitment to make sure that those newcomer gardeners had continued access. So that limited what was going to happen, what kind of development that could happen there. And so it remains a community garden, and the idea is it gets developed into, because it's small, quite contaminated. Everything has to be above the raised beds and everything. But the idea is that it will become an urban agriculture innovation site, experimenting with different types of higher intensity farming that is possible, and hopefully down the road some increased production capacity so that there can be social enterprise opportunities, and so this is the community economic development piece. And that is actually a link to the church. We happen to have 4 kitchens in the building, and 2 of them are commercial grade.
Wow.
And yeah, that's another whole story. But what you need in order to turn growing into production is the value-added possibility of preparing food. And so we're still working on how that can happen, but the idea of growing some food, like a hot pepper sauce or chili sauce that lots of the Tibetan folks make, is one thing that has been considered. But that's a bit of the story of the Milky Way Garden.
Oh, wish you didn't mention the pepper sauce. Now I'm sort of low-key salivating. So, let's first of all, just so we learn terms and acquire vocabulary, just tell us a bit, what is a land trust exactly?
So after the last couple of days and learning all about trust law, maybe I'm not as sure as I was. But what I know is that the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust is a community organization, democratically organized and led, so it's elected members of the community and representatives from local organizations who acquire land off of the private market. And there's a caveat to that, but off the private market for the most part, and the organization becomes the owner of that land, and they hold it, but then they partner with an operating partner of some kind to use that land. So more and more it's affordable housing that is the goal, and so we have a few community partners that are running community housing on that land. So the purpose of a land trust is really just to grab land off of the market, to stop it from being privately developed, and then partnering locally for various possibilities. But it's primarily about affordable housing at this phase.
Great, thank you. It's helpful to know these notions. In your sermon today, you were quite particular about two words, to have and to hold, that most of us only know from the marriage rite. And you kind of blew my mind this weekend when you said that actually it's older than the marriage rite and may have come in from property usages, if I understood you correctly. That's already fascinating and potentially troubling about gender relations and who's doing the having and the holding. So I just thought it was about embracing, but these terms have very particular meanings to you. Could you say a little bit about what you're trying to teach us by helping us distinguish between the having and the holding, and moving us away from the having to the holding?
Well, I know there's a legal historian in the room, so I will defer where necessary. I've come at this in a couple of different ways. This is the more recent way, because I just happened to discover that in the title to the land where my parish sits on. And I had only known it from the marriage rite and thought the same thing that you did. I believe that it moves in that direction. It started as property law and moved into the marriage rite. That may not be correct, but I think that's the case. I discovered it through a number of people in Black studies. It goes back to a poet named Nathaniel Mackey. In that it may have a history besides that as well, but there's a line in one of his poems about being held, not had. And so it captured me. And then there's another person you may actually know, J. Cameron Carter.
Yeah.
And I've followed that through his work as well. He picked up on that and ran a program at Duke sort of around that theme. And I became fascinated by the idea, but recognized that the way that Black Studies is addressing that question, and the way that sort of Mackey opens that up, is a much different way than I needed to think about it, because I have never been a victim of this transatlantic slave trade. And being had and held, it's something that is being wrestled with in that discourse. The fact that enslaved people were brought in the hold of a ship is one of these things that they're sort of wrestling with. But I was taken with the distinction and wondered, what does it mean for a white settler person to think through that distinction? And then what I came to realize is that I think for people like me, it is a process of moving from having, which is our sort of default, to holding, which is a process of letting go, which in the Christian tradition is also a really key movement within mystical spirituality. The discipline of letting go is something that we learn, especially from the mystics, but it goes all the way back to Christ's kenotic self-emptying. And how do we imitate that? And I think that the way we imitate that is by that process of letting go of all the false self that we tend to grasp onto, and the possessions that help to build that false self for us. So there's resources within the Christian tradition to begin that journey. And so these are sort of the steps that I was following to get to that question and just realizing how tightly the church, in my experience in particular, it tries to hold on to these assets, and recognizing, again, going back to the community work, there was a real open-handedness in this community work, a real sense that there is wealth here. It's wealth that comes from the community and therefore should be shared with the community. And so to move out of that sense that, you know, of having and of pulling from social wealth and turning it into private wealth is something that I was learning from my community work, and wondering why the church was not more actively engaged in living into the abundance that we know God has given us.
Yeah. And in some of your writing, there is this term that you just now used that would be helpful also to define about social wealth, and that the real estate folks and investment people do recognize neighborhoods like Parkdale as possessing a certain kind of social wealth, right? It's got a certain buzz, a feel, it's partly affective, it's, you know, certain neighborhoods just make us feel exciting to be in because we like the character and the diversity and so some of this is what you mean by social wealth, but you can build in on that. But the point is to convert a neighborhood that has social wealth, build on it, raise the rents, right? Kick out the people who can no longer afford those rents, and then you have converted the social wealth into financial wealth. And this is a process repeatedly happening in North American urban contexts, everywhere. Tragically, of course, the minute that happens, the strings and the intimate ties that generate that social wealth are dissolved, because it's precisely who's there that makes the social wealth what it is. Right? So could you say a little bit about this process of the movement from social wealth to financial wealth, which is like the inverse from holding to having, right?
I mean, I think it is the movement of gentrification in our world. It is neighborhoods become desirable because of the life that exists there. And the most interesting, quote unquote, neighborhoods are the ones where it's affordable for different and interesting kinds of people to live. And there's a seizing of the spirit of that neighborhood, which is a part of the wealth of that neighborhood, and turning it into, in the piece I sent you, there's a video link. I don't know if that...
I didn't get to watch the video.
It may be taken down already. It was by a real estate firm in Toronto who was marketing Parkdale.
Oh,
and
wow.
kept referring to it as an up-and-coming neighborhood. And I think that's the really significant piece about it, is that it is the theft of social wealth. It is the taking out of the common pool of available energy, material, spirit, and then turned into a product to sell to an individual or a family, and so it's a deep problem in the gentrification world, but it's also, again, I think there's a way to think about this in theological terms, and this was a bit of what I spoke about yesterday, that we have this memory that we bear within our scriptures and our traditions, that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, and that is a gift for the whole of creation and not for a particular group or segment of that creation. And yet we seem to be very comfortable in a world where that social wealth, if you want to call it that, has been privately appropriated and is held on, is had in these various ways. And I think there's that memory can be subversive if we really pay close attention to it and recognize that social wealth is better for all of us.
So, a question. For those of us listening carefully, there is in your discourse of moving from having to holding, and letting go of this inclination towards property ownership, the possibility of reading your rhetoric as radically anti-capitalist. And this is partly what I mean by the fact that you're a troublemaker, dangerous fellow here. But neither in your sermon nor in some of your pieces do you make that explicit. You seem to be opting for a kind of stealth strategy of moving us from a certain kind of imaginative relation to land and property. So you seem to want to turn our hearts and minds away from this possessive inclination. And partly I wonder, is this a kind of a strategic sense that if hearts are transformed by different practices, that you might not need to, like wave, the Communist Manifesto and marshal a certain rhetoric, because you're trying to change hearts, not necessarily to, for what I take to be a socialist project of some kind. Is that true? Is that what you're trying to do?
In some respects, I mean, yes, I think that it's the changing of our hearts, and I think, again, the Christian tradition, we have the resources there to live in that direction. And I think that if that's the basis of it, then when there is a transition to a more just society, it's going to be a lasting one. And it's not just going to be the flopping of wealth and power from one group to another, but it will be that continual process of letting go. We were talking with Carmen yesterday about the potlatch. There's just, if there's a lot that I think we can learn about that sense that what really matters is the giving. And in the giving, in the sharing, we are all better off. And not even just in a naive kind of way that we'll all get along better, but I think the more we're open to that movement towards sharing, and the more that is experienced collectively, I think the happier we'll be. So yeah, it's not a political program for me, but I have learned from those political traditions, and I guess gathered a little bit of language from them as well. But I've never been a member of the Communist Party. And I'm always interested in what it is from where I am, what is it that I can bring to just be a better neighbor and to help to create a better neighborhood and to go from there. So back to the neighborhood work, a part of what's been happening in Parkdale over the years is not an attempted revolution, but an attempted transformation. From the grassroots, a slow kind of movement towards a different way of living as neighbors. And that could then seed that imagination in other places. So I think it's that process of transformation, but it's also a matter of, and this gets back to theology again, of not subordinating the means to the ends. So we need to be living now the world we're trying to build in the same way that the kingdom, the reign of God, is the way we experience it now as a foretaste of the fullness of that reign. But so there's a connection, and I think that's one of the really important things about a movement like the Community Land Trust movement, that it's not just about grabbing and moving things from one side of the ledger to the other, but it's living this democratic organization. It's living in the kind of world that we want to create.
Thank you. I think that still makes you a troublemaker. A question. You mentioned the potlatch, and I know from reading your work that you are intimately attentive to the fact that this land is not ours. And as Carmen Lansdowne, an Indigenous leader and moderator of the UCC, said, treaty or not, none of this land is other than unceded land. And I think there are two ways in which I've seen in your work that you're quite attentive to Indigenous communities. One is that you're actually making an argument that the practices of dispossession, if the people who live here don't count, we can take their property, is in some way being replicated, actually almost identically, right? The people who live in Parkdale now, before it's fully gentrified, can be moved. They have no right, per se, to be in the places they've known and loved, perhaps even for generations. So there's a part of your work where you're extremely attentive to the ways in which not just Canadians, but North Americans are replicating the very processes of dispossession that marginalized and removed people from where they are. So there's a kind of negative diagnosis. But there's also in your work a real attentive to the positive commitments of the particular ways in which Indigenous people lived in the land that is now Ontario. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the positive and the negative ways in which you're seeking to learn from Indigenous histories and practices.
The negative that you mentioned is something I draw from Glenn Coulthard, who's a Dene political philosopher at UBC. And he draws the connection between the notion of terra nullius, this colonial idea that the land was empty when the colonists arrived, and obviously not literally, because it was populated with Indigenous people. But the argument was they aren't living on the land the way that they should be, and so they therefore don't have the right to keep it. And so he sees the similar process happening in urban neighborhoods like Parkdale, but also like Vancouver and probably Victoria as well, that there is this sense that it's this new frontier that investors are exploring, and the people that are living there now, like, you can't ignore that there are people there, but they're not living in the way that they're supposed to. They're not living like good middle-class people. So therefore, they don't have the right to stay there, so they can be removed. So that's the negative, and I've been very inspired and influenced by the analysis of Indigenous thinkers that are helping settler people like me to realize the system that I'm a part of and what it's doing. The positive, I mean, if reconciliation is our goal, it's all about relationship. It's all about a real attention and listening to and partnering with and building friendships with, and that's the long work that settler folks often are impatient about. But then there's the work of what I called after the work of Paddy Krawick of our winter work. We need to spend some winters alone exploring our own tradition, recognizing what we've done, and recognizing within our traditions and our ways of being that it didn't have to be this way. And so this process of letting go, the spirituality of letting go is one of those things. Maybe that turns into a different way of relating to land and a different way of relating to Indigenous people. But I guess, and the final thing would be that I've just had an experience of being influenced and taught in a positive way by Indigenous folks in lots of different, in several different contexts. And so if I, and I probably should have named that when you asked about how I got interested in land, because there are certain points along the way, one of them that I mentioned in that piece, especially learning from Indigenous women. Paddy Krawick is from the territory where I live, but then there was someone who came from Coast Salish territory to the Milky Way Garden and led us through an exploration of that land in a way that, as I think about it, this is actually key to that story, that opened up the spirituality of that land to me in a way that I had never seen before. And a part of that process was asking us to remove our shoes and walk around on the land. But I have a lot of work to do around building relationships and friendships and subordinating my desire to get things done to that slow work of friendship that I'm still working on.
my last question, and then we'll turn to folks here. You have repeatedly said that there are Christian resources, both theological and practical, for living into holding without having. And you know from my interests in the levelers and the diggers that way of holding land in common, taking St. George's Hill, farming there, and then sharing to all, that those kinds of concrete historical precedents, which are both practical and theological, fully integrated, are part of our past. And I think that you're drawing from there in your writing about commoning. You use this word. Commons not as a noun, but as a verb. And I think you're drawing directly from those kinds of historical precedents. So could you just tell us a little bit about how you draw from that and what you mean by the verb commoning?
Yeah, I think it certainly reaches back to the English commons as a way of holding land. But the shift to the verb is J.K. Gibson Graham. That's a writing duo who write about post-capitalist transition. And what they pointed out to me was that when you talk about the commons, we tend to think about a particular piece of land or a particular area. But their argument is that anything can be commoned. Even if the ownership structure doesn't change, even if it remains privately held, it can still be commoned. So even if the commons is the goal, commoning is the work of getting there by simply being in spaces, occupying spaces, sharing in spaces that, regardless of what, according to the common law, what the nature of that land is, it can be commoned simply by sharing on it.
Like St. John's and its property. Yeah. Thank you. And now, Alistair as Phil Donahue. Questions?
Thank you very much, Jason and John, for this very engaging session. First, I have an observation about definitions, and secondly, a question to Jason about life in Parkdale. The observation is taken from a photograph I have of an episode in the long and troublesome history between the Doukhobor community in British Columbia and the Canadian state, represented by the provincial government. And in this photograph are a group of Doukhobors who have a sign which says, this is not land we own, we are stewards of the Lord in this place. And I think in terms of definition for particularly church folks, the distinction between ownership, however we define that, and obviously the common law has a definition of it. Ownership on the one hand, which suggests the right to exclude, right? And stewardship on the other, we may have it for a time, but if we don't use it for whether it's God's desires or the community's desires, we may lose it. So that's a little story about the distinction between ownership and stewardship. Yep. My question for you, Jason, is I think you revealed earlier on in your comments that this Milky Way area lies adjacent to your parish property. Question, have you and your community given any thought to the way in which that trust might be allowed to encroach upon parish land to extend the Milky Way garden and perhaps think of other uses to which it could be put. And if you have thought about that, what do you see as the problems that might get in the way because of the way in which the Anglican Church organizes itself and its holding of property?
Thank you for that, John. Both the image that you evoked and that question. I was just thinking about it. So it's immediately to the east. So we don't have an east-facing altar, but if we did, it would be, I would be staring, I mean, there's a wall, obviously, but I would be staring into the Milky Way garden every time I was celebrating the Eucharist, which brings another dimension of sacramentality, I think, to that. But it's essentially the backyard of the church. We are, actually, I think much like you, our entire site is basically taken up by the building. So there's no spare land to sever or to share. But this kitchen sharing idea is something that we have considered and we will continue to explore. It also turns out that the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, I don't sit on the board any longer, but they are users of our building. So their offices are in the building, as is because I told you the land trust owns the land. They partner with another organization who operates. And the other organization is also in the building. So their offices, they're called Greenest City. They operate all the community gardens in the neighborhood, but that one in particular. So their offices are in the back of the church, so they oversee that garden. So it's complicated I don't know how you'd sever, within the building to mark off what could be handed over, but I think there is more and more openness to sharing. So I don't think in principle, there's a barrier to deeper and deeper partnership and more sharing. We're just trying to figure out. So in fact, one thing we did is the Milky Way garden, as I said, no power is run down in the laneway or water. So we ran a water line from the church that feeds the garden, which is a small thing, unless you're a church warden who's thinking about the water bill, and that's one more pipe that could freeze and flood the basement. But slowly we're moving in that direction of more and more sharing.
Hold on for the mic. So
So as a former church warden, also chair of the finance committee, can I ask, because I'm intrigued by these other groups using your space for their offices, do you charge them rent?
We do.
Because again, we have our parish house and we rent to various organizations and we charge the rent. Maybe we could think about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the principle of sharing is where we start, and then we figure out how we do this best together. And so we have 5 or 6 local organizations. A number of years ago, we made the decision that we're not just going to monetize our spare space, but we're going to make sure that we partner with local value-aligned organizations. And so we don't just open it to anyone. They're all not-for-profits. They're all doing work that we support, that the church frankly can't do. In a former age, we would have maybe been doing some of this stuff, but there's not the energy there to do it. So in some ways, the building is continuing to do the ministry that it used to do, but it's being done through community partners. But I think there's a principle. So we've had the City of Toronto set up a warming center for a couple of winters, and we charged them a lot. It wasn't quite market rent, but it was a lot of money. But a local, like this charity that's overseeing the Milky Way Garden, they're getting a well below market rate. And I think, I think that principle of let's just work together. Well, those who have should give, and those who don't should receive, and trying to let the building live into that ministry of sharing.
Jamie, do you have a question before you disappear? Get in one before you disappear.
More just a statement of thanks. I teach political economy in my day job, and these things you evoke speak to different parts of me, and it is a wondrous thing when those two parts of me collide happily together. I also suspect there's a familial connection somehow to your place, because Graham Cotter was a friend of the family, and he was one of these worker priests who came in the 40s to a very poor part of town. Gun battles in Cabbage Town at the time, I'm told. And it's a noteworthy parish for its theology and its living of the theology, and it's wonderful to meet the steward. But I don't have good questions, but I am on fire. I would love to know whether the folks at OUR Eco Village or Deb Curran were part of this, because part of their work on tenure revision was important on the peninsula in making a kind of communal experience possible in the face of how common law works on this island.
Thank you. I'll just briefly, because Graham Cotter, who just turned 96 a couple of weeks ago, or a month or so ago, he embedded the DNA in that place that I'm trying to reactivate. So just briefly to tell you, he's considered almost a saint among the folks that are there. So Graham, a white guy, but grew up in Jamaica. When he came to Parkdale, Parkdale, as I mentioned, was a place where newcomers were often landed. So the migration from the Caribbean in the 60s and 70s made Parkdale a place where lots of those folks landed. And Graham offered a very explicit welcome to folks who, going to other Anglican churches, would experience overt and implicit acts of racism towards them, but they found a safe place at St. Mark's Parkdale. And it continues, so that the people that Graham welcomed are still the people that make that place go because of that welcome that they received from him. But he was, an important figure in Parkdale, more broadly.
And then glorious eccentric.
Yes.
It's not a question, but just sharing, and many of the people here probably know about the Shelburne Community Kitchen here in Victoria. And it's churches, and it has a commercial kitchen right now in St. Luke's Lutheran Church. But I envision this business of your community kitchens, your commercial kitchens. What the Shelburne Community Kitchen has done is same thing. They have gardens that people have given over. They have fresh produce. They are teaching people to cook. They are targeting a corridor in Victoria that they of not unhoused but low-income people and some immigrants, some seniors on their own, and it's a really wonderful collaboration. And I just can see those commercial kitchens brimming with activity and all kinds of wonderful things. And thank you. That's really, really.
Yeah, those assets are really important in communities, and when they're locked up in churches and not shared, that's a problem. So, just sharing.
First off, thank you both for the insights and the work you've done over the past few days. It's been a very rich time of reflection. And I appreciate you digging into the history of our tradition and talking about tools to deal with the present housing crisis and issue. But one thing that I've been surprised that I haven't heard too much about in the past few days has been the tradition of the Jubilee, which once upon a time in the Old Testament was how the society at large dealt with the issue, so that you would forgive the debts of tenants, bond servants, and then they'd be able to return to the land. So, which is a large chunk of what the Old Testament is dealing with in terms of land rights, tenant rights, debt servants. And I wonder if you could just both offer some reflection of that. I mean, granted, our institutional church does not have the scope to forgive my visa bill, we live for the day. But if you could offer some reflection on these issues. I appreciate it.
I mean, I can say very briefly. So I quoted Leviticus 25 in the homily, and that comes in that Jubilee context. I think for me, it's basically just I haven't gotten there yet. I've been trying to think of resources within Scripture and tradition to help us to let go, and Jubilee is just something I haven't yet dug into. But I'm aware of that tradition. I'm aware of the old excuse of it was never practiced, and so it doesn't really matter. So that's not my take. But I thank you for putting it back in mind for me, Matthew. But I think that's just further down the road for me as one more theological resource.
And I'm in the same situation. My attention to land and thinking about land is no more than 2 years old. But I've started on this in part to learn with my students. And so for the same reason, I just haven't gotten around to it. But I do know enough to know that the old excuse no longer seems to be carrying. I think there are more and more people saying that it was practiced. Perhaps not as routinely as it should have been, but that it was not entirely unpracticed either. It wasn't just a principle. So thank you. Brendan?
Thanks. I sometimes have this like imagination of writing a novel, not for me. Mostly someone else should write the novel of a kind of a different version of Canada where Jubilee was still practiced by the settler Christians who came, and so we would have these like regular cycles of everything returning to the original stewards, which would be an alternate reality that I would like to see what that would be like.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was mentioned a few times, and John, you kind of picked up in your response to Carmen the other day, was the moral formative power of the kind of late capitalist age that we find ourselves in. It's in our pockets. We can't escape it, right? And Jason, yesterday you kind of named that as a systemic
Formation.
Yeah.
Structural avarice?
Structural avarice, right? That we just can, like, we can't, this is the water that we swim in. And so we have within our tradition, which is something that you're trying to tap into, these formative practices, these counter-cultural formative practices that point to a different way. And I think, like, we need to really remember those, and that's what you're calling us to. So I'm wondering if each of you could name one or two of what those practices are and how we might remember and reintegrate those into our lives in a way that we might try to, embody this alternate faithfulness that is available to us.
Well, he's the person being interviewed, so I'm just hosting, but I'll let you go first.
This encounter with this spiritual reality of common land in the Milky Way Garden happened for me kind of simultaneously with the discovery of centering prayer, of that Christian practice of non-discursive prayer. And the whole idea behind centering prayer is just this practice of letting go. Every thought that comes into your head, you just let it go. So I think that's one of the practices. So I'm not saying that centering prayer itself will lead us in that direction, but I think and not just so the Christian practices of meditation and into the world of mindfulness, I think all of those practices move us in that direction. And I think if we're open to that going sort of all the way down to the way that we live in the world and with other people, that it can be more than just a form of self-fulfillment or, a way of navigating trauma. Or there's lots of good uses for it, but that's one possible extension of that practice. And the other one, and this is one I'm going to have some conversations with when I get back with our congregation, is what we've been talking about over the couple of weeks, because Brendan and I have been at a couple of gatherings around this question, is thinking about reparations to Indigenous communities, which doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to start with, let's give the entirety of this lot to a local Indigenous community, but starts with the smaller practices. And so one that has been spoken of is the reality that the churches and charities don't pay property tax. So we don't pay that tax to the state, but perhaps we should be paying the equivalent value of that tax to the Indigenous community who I hope we would believe is actually sovereign over that territory. And I think even for a little place like us, we have a social justice budget, and we could probably actually do that pretty easily. I don't want to speak, I'm not the finance person, I don't know, but it seems like a good step. So I think those are two. So one is a stewardship practice in the sort of traditional sense, and the other is a contemplative practice.
I would just remind us that the central practice of the church is profoundly economic. And I think that part of the trouble with why Eucharist doesn't seem to be producing the kinds of transformations we would wish is that we've decontextualized its fundamentally oikonomic character, right? There's a reason why Paul took such trouble saying, look, you can't come and eat a ton of the Eucharist and then people come late and then they don't get any, right? This was a meal that established the conditions for the community's very living. And the early comers were eating too much, right? So the kind of circular character of the table and the fact that our eating practices are what is at stake here. How we eat, with whom we eat, who gets fed, who doesn't get fed, all of that is fundamentally imaged here. And to the extent that we keep forgetting that that's what's going on here, I think we're missing the power of our core practice. And I do think that theologically, insofar as the structure of the meal is forgotten and co-opted into a kind of substitutionary atonement game, then the lateral relationship that is implied here is forgotten. That it's about us together and whether we're being a community. So I would say that that's a pretty powerful feature of our life that we really need to relearn. Kate? Oh, wait for the mic so that the folks listening online can.
I don't have much to say other than thank you, but I can't help but be curious about our Mennonite brothers and sisters with whom we share communion and what their insights might be in this conversation, particularly usufruct, the use of land allocated and then returned. Understand?
Oh, there's a question from Zoom, too.
I'll let you reflect on that.
Yeah. So I don't know in the specific Mennonite context how to respond to that, or in the sort of the legal context, but I know that usufruct is maybe another way of talking about holding. And I've thought about it, but not enough to formulate a good thought and response.
No, and it's something I know nothing about. I will keep my mouth closed.
So the question from Deb online is, some churches have a fair bit of land. If the church community in Victoria wanted to set up something similar to what you've done with the Milky Way Garden, would you be open to being consulted and sharing how you did it and advising on any pitfalls?
Yes, certainly, because I've seen how effective community land trusts can be. I think the church needs to get in the community land trust game. I'll put it out there publicly. I think that the Anglican Church of Canada should probably get into that game in a way, because they're in a position to do that in a way that I think dioceses aren't, who are too sort of busy with what they're doing and making those decisions, as Brendan well knows. But I suspect that if there was an instrument where dioceses could transfer land into a trust, hopefully one held by Indigenous communities, and if that was facilitated somewhere else outside of the diocese, that would actually be a relief, and it would be a good way of planning for the future.
Any last question? All right. Jason, it's just been wonderful to share these last several days with you.
Likewise.
I appreciate not just the spirit of wisdom, of groundedness, and then just a real, as I said, a kind of muscular commitment to action that goes very deep. You are helping us to transform our imaginations and our practices. We owe you all, all of us owe you a tremendous debt of thanks. So thank you.
Well, let me just reciprocate too and just say how grateful I am to have spent these last couple of days with you and with the other folks that I've been able to spend this more intensive time with. And then this community, as you mentioned, John and I were talking about the warmth of this place. And I won't get into the cliches about, so I've lived in Vancouver, I've lived in Toronto. The West Coast spirit is much closer to my heart. And I'm just more and more coming to realize that. But I've just really appreciated the warmth and openness of almost everybody I've encountered here in Victoria. So thank you all.
So that's a round of applause for all of you. Thanks again.